Hello and welcome to Freedom Watch, your daily dose of raw liberty online at foxnews.com/Freedom Watch. I'm Judge Andrew Napolitano here defending freedom, defending your natural rights, and defending your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. The Goldman Sachs case reveals the complexity and the incestuous nature of the relationship between Wall Street and the federal government. In this case, Goldman is accused of not telling its most sophisticated customers, two other banks, of the risk inherent in purchasing certain mortgage-backed securities, and of not telling these banks that another of Goldman's clients was betting against the success of these instruments. The entire case will revolve around whether this information was material. Stated differently, was this information that Goldman should have revealed, or was it objectively apparent that the purchasing banks ought to have known about it as well? Also, does a seller need to reveal that another of its clients believes that the item being sold is not worth its value? Goldman lost $90 million on this deal, and the SEC knows that. So what is the SEC accomplishing by seeking disgorgement of profits when there were none? I'll tell you what it's accomplishing. It's establishing a political atmosphere in which it will be easier to enhance government regulations over the financial community. Is it proper for the government to time its litigation against a private entity in order to enhance its legislative agenda? That's what it's doing. Finally, Goldman says it was blindsided by the lawsuit. It was. How do I know that? Because the federal rules of civil procedure, the rules in court that govern these cases, require that before suing anyone, the plaintiff must first ask the person that he's going to sue for what he wants and be turned down. The SEC never asked Goldman for a nickel from this matter before it sued them. And that is a basis for dismissing the lawsuit. Joining me now is Lew Rockwell, chair of the Mises Institute. Lew, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Judge, great to be with you.
Neither you nor I hold any water for Goldman Sachs. These guys are the recipient of some of the biggest, most outrageous, most unconstitutional, most immoral corporate welfare in the history of the Western world. But they are defendants in a lawsuit brought by the federal government, which I argue is frivolous and was timed in order to make allow the president to make his argument. See how bad these bankers are? We have to have more power to regulate them.
Judge, you're exactly right, and I hate to say this about Goldman Sachs, but I think they were right in this instance. In fact, as you point out, they were long and lost a whole lot of money in this, and they thought that the client who was right was crazy. So they had no obligation, but I believe this case is phony. It's designed to be tossed out of a court. It's just a trick. After all, Goldman is one of the biggest donors to the Obama campaign.
Exactly.
So this is just a trick, and it's to get this legislation through, which, by the way, will be very beneficial to Goldman Sachs. So what they should have done to Goldman Sachs is let them go out of business when they were bankrupt back during the economic crisis,
Precisely.
Instead of ripping off every single regular American for the benefit of these zillionaires on Wall Street.
So the government revived Goldman only so that it could sue Goldman for one of the few things that Goldman did that was lawful and moral.
Exactly right, although it's, again, all a trick. As you say, it's a political trick. And, of course, they don't hesitate to do anything, including bringing phony lawsuits to get this bill through Congress. Obama's going to Wall Street or near Wall Street to give a attack on the banks while he's actually seeking to benefit the big banks.
Absolutely. Now, without getting too much in the weeds, when you sell something to someone, you always believe it's worth less than what you're getting for it. Otherwise, you wouldn't sell it. How could it possibly be a basis for litigation that Goldman created an instrument and sold it and believed that it was worth less than what it sold it for? You do that when you sell a house.
Well, of course, that's true. If they thought it was worth more, they'd keep it, or they'd find a buyer who would pay a higher price. But these, of course, guys they make deals. People on Wall Street in their good incarnation. They're making deals. They're making money. They thought that they were selling a good product. They were on the side of the long side, not the short side of the mortgage market. Of course, this Paulson and Company made a lot of money from understanding that there was a real estate bubble. It was going to break, and they had the timing right. Goldman was wrong. So Goldman didn't lie. In this particular instance, they didn't lie. They didn't trick anybody. The banks that lost the money were on the same side as Goldman. They all thought that Paulson and Company was nuts. But Paulson and Company was, of course, right.
And the banks that lost the money, A, are as sophisticated as Goldman, and B, sometimes sell the same type of products to other banks that they just bought from Goldman. So everybody in this incestuous inner circle either knew or ought to have known what was going on, and yet the government will not seek to use this as a basis for arguing that all this private buyer and seller activity should be regulated by federal bureaucrats, sort of like Medicare, Medicaid, Amtrak, the post office. They want to destroy this part of the economic system as well.
Well, one of the worst aspects of the economic crisis and of the power seizure that came after it was more and more government control over the capital markets.
Right.
So they're having more and more control over every little detail, and we're going to be more like France, or maybe worse than France, in having government bureaucrats who are, of course, taking bribes and connected to the big boys, making decisions that will crush middle and small-sized companies, prevent creative innovation, to keep the banks and Wall Street firms living the lifestyle they're currently living and free from competition. That is what's going on. This is not Obama and company are not trying to hurt Wall Street or hurt the big banks. They are hurting the average American for the benefit of Wall Street and the benefit of the big banks. Always assume anything out of a politician's mouth is a lie, and you'll be pretty much right.
Are we ever going to see a return to a true free market, which I will define as free from government regulation, where willing buyers and willing sellers can invest as they want, where the government doesn't provide some sort of a safety net under you so that you can be as risky and crazy as you want with other people's money, and where you don't have to report to the government or get their permission for how you invest or who you contract with or what you pay your principal executives? Or is that just fanciful, this argument for freedom that you've devoted your career to making and that I do my best to make here on Fox?
Judge, this is the great moral argument. If we care about human flourishing, if we care about the future of children and grandchildren and our country into the years ahead, this is the kind of principles that we will advance and we'll try to uphold. But when you see that more than or close to 80% of the American people in the latest Pew poll do not trust the government, and that it's been going down ever since a high in 1958, I think that, yes, there is absolutely a chance to try to move back, or move forward, rather, towards a free market, the free market as you define it, not the way the Republican Party defines it, certainly not the way Obama defines it, but actual freedom where people are free to profit, and if they make a loss, they bear the loss. They can't shift it through the government onto other people.
I want you to take off your hat as an economist, your hat as a philosopher of government, and put on your political hat. And this debate is going to rage between now and November, and then it'll rage for another 2 years. For those of us who believe in freedom like you and Ron Paul and I and most people watching this show do, is it better for us to hold our noses and vote for the Republican on the theory that almost any Republican is better than any Democrat? Or should the freedom movement, whether you call it Tea Party or Campaign for Liberty or whatever you want to call it, should that movement be putting up third-party candidates who really will argue for natural rights, for human freedom, for limited government, for a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution, even though those folks might not win the first time their names are on the ballots?
Judge, because I have to take off my hat as head of the Mises Institute, too. But yes, I think that voting for Republicans is a bad idea. I mean, it's not true that Republicans are always better. I would argue that George W. Bush was actually far worse than Bill Clinton, and I hold no brief for Bill Clinton. So sometimes a guy like John McCain is every bit as bad as Obama. So I think it's not a good idea to vote for Republicans just holding your nose, and because it also involves putting a blindfold over your eyes. But I think you're exactly right that third parties and dissident efforts, whether it's the Tea Parties, other things that are going to come about, there's a political revolution going on in this country. People are for the first time, very, very upset about deficits. They're upset about high taxes. They're upset about regulations and controls from the people in Washington. And so I think there's going to be very interesting things happening in 2012. We're not going to just have some old-tired Republican and some old-tired Democrat, they're old-tired solutions, I should say, trying to pretend that they're opposites when they're just, as Butler Schaefer puts it, two wings of the same bird of prey.
I'm 100% with you. Lew Rockwell, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.